Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Six to Celebrate tour of abandoned Staten Island cemeteries. We have a lot of great programming coming up. There are two Six to Celebrate in-person walking tours, a food tour of Little Caribbean on November 5th and a tour of Park Chester on November 12th. There is a preservation school class where you can learn about the New York City Municipal Archives on November 9th. We also have our annual gala. Okay, we'll fix that in a second. Municipal Archives on November 9th. We also have our annual gala, the Landmarks Lion, where we will be honoring Frank Sanchez on November 29th. Please check out our website, hdc.org, for more information and to sign up. Tonight's tour will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel for free. You may also watch all of our previous preservation school classes and virtual tours on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions about programming, you can contact me at marbulu@hdc.org. I would also like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting this tour tonight and Six to Celebrate. Now I will hand it over to Michael Pelczar. I think I pronounced that right, sorry. The Assistant Executive Director of Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries for tonight's tour. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And of course, thank you to HTC and Six to Celebrate for inviting us to this Zoom presentation and to talk about our abandoned cemeteries here on Staten Island. So my name is Michael Pelczar, and I'm the Assistant Executive Director of Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries. And for those of you who don't know, Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries of Staten Island is a nonprofit dedicated to the care, restoration, and seasonal maintenance of 11 Staten Island cemeteries dating from 1690 through 1979. So this covers a great deal of Staten Island and New York City history. Each of the locations that FASI cares for are different in their own way. They're historically significant in their own way. And there are many interesting people under our care in these cemeteries. So if we could head on over to the next slide, we have a little bit of a visual for you guys. These are all of the signs that appear outside the FASI properties across Staten Island. And they're instantly recognizable. They're large white signs, and they indicate that the property is under the care of FASI. So we always like to show that visual just so that people get a sense of how many properties are under our protection. And if we head on over to the next slide, I will share with you some details about the history of the organization, a little bit more about what FASI does. So FASI was founded in 1981 and started as a volunteer group of concerned citizens who noticed that these historic cemeteries across Staten Island were in various states of deterioration. They were often neglected, often not taken care of. Those who had family buried in the cemeteries many times had left Staten Island or even New York State itself to move elsewhere. And the organizations set up to care for the cemeteries, the cemetery boards, had been dissolved. So there was really nobody to take care of or maintain these properties. And if anybody has any experience with grounds maintenance, you know that it doesn't take long, perhaps a season or two, for nature to really start reclaiming a location. So that's where FASI steps in and decides to make a difference. FASI has reclaimed and restored 11 Staten Island cemeteries, performing seasonal grounds maintenance and preservation work for 21 acres of cemetery property. So it's a big job, and we can't do that without the support of the community, which we'll talk about in a second. Additionally, not only does FASI perform cemetery maintenance, it has also transcribed thousands of historic documents and made those documents available to the public via digitization. So FASI also has an extensive collection of records. These include 19th century funeral books from local undertakers and records of who's buried in our cemeteries. Often these lists are incomplete, but we have transcribed to the best of our ability the material that we have. So if we head on over to our next slide, you'll get to meet all of the community groups who have made a difference for FASI. Now, FASI, simply cannot function without the support of the community. And indeed, we've had many such groups participate in cleanups and community service efforts, just to name a few. We've had the Navy, we've had the Marines, we've had the Boy Scouts of America, we've had local private and public schools, we've had hundreds of individuals and community groups, and some of them even come back year after year for annual or seasonal events over and over again. So it truly is thanks to the support of the community that we are able to save these sites. And we just have a little quote here. Executive Director Lynn Rogers has enabled community groups to responsibly recover historic landscapes embedded in their surroundings. So this is really the bulk of the work that FASI does. If you head on over to our next slide, we'll also tell you about the fun part. So this is the part that everybody enjoys, and this is the part that is my favorite as well. We educate the public through FASI, and we do that at events. So FASI has hosted a wide range of public programs during its history. These special events were intended to educate and entertain. So we have done, for example, sea shanty performances, where we had a well-known sea shanty singer come to one of our cemeteries that's located by the water. He sang songs of the 19th century maritime tradition, and we tailored a tour specifically to sea captains and those who lived their lives and made their living on the sea. So that was a very fun event. We've also done Civil War reenactments, as the picture here indicates. Believe it or not, that is actually an original restored New York cannon that the volunteers in this picture are using. So that's always a fun fact that we like to highlight in our event repertoire. We've also done nighttime lantern tours, especially around this time of year. I know that Halloween is right around the corner, and that typically means that people are in the mood for ghost stories and lantern tours and all of that fun seasonal stuff, which we will talk about a little bit more as the slideshow goes on. But throughout all of the events, the common thread is that we want to share history with the public, but we also want people to leave entertained and excited and invested in these properties. We want people to understand why these locations are important and what's worthwhile about saving them. So if we head on over to our next slide, you're going to see a pretty shocking visual. This is a black and white photo circa 2001 of Staten Island Cemetery. And this is located on Richmond Terrace on the north shore of Staten Island, for those familiar with the borough. Staten Island Cemetery was founded in 1847 as part of the New York State Rural Cemetery Act. By the 1950s, the cemetery had entered a state of serious decline. It was at one time labeled the most shameful cemetery in New York State, and that's due to the incredible amount of vandalism and illegal dumping and criminal activity that took place at the cemetery. FASI recognized that the site did indeed need saving, and if we head on to our next slide, you will see the same vantage point, but a picture taken in 2019. So this is our official welcome to Staten Island and welcome to our virtual cemetery tour. This is the same location, and as you can see, the grounds have been brought under control. There is now a fence that surrounds the property, and this former blight, this beacon for bad behavior in the community, has become a restful, contemplative place, somewhere where people can come relax, enjoy history, and participate in one of the public events that FASI hosts. So that being said, I would like to invite you all to come along for a virtual tour of our cemeteries. And if we head on to the next slide, I have a tombstone that I would like to talk a little bit about. The oldest surviving stones under FASI's care are brownstones. And here's a photo of one of the oldest stones in our cemeteries. This is located in Blazing Star Cemetery in Rossville on Staten Island. This tombstone features a winged soul effigy. So for those not familiar, this was a common symbol during the colonial era. As you can see, there is a little angel head with a wig of the time period, and it's surrounded by wings. So this is a visual representation of the ascension of the spirit the hope that there is life after death and that the deceased who's buried under the stone will fly up towards their afterlife. This stone also has a moving inscription, which I will read to you guys. The inscription is as follows: "A child and grandchildren may deplore the loss of her that is no more. Her frugal hand no more provide. We trust she rests at Jesus's side." So religious sentiment was common at the time. Often these epitaphs or inscriptions were written in the style of poetry with rhymes and references to either the grief of those left behind or the hope that their loved one will achieve salvation in the afterlife. This is something that we see again and again on tombstones of that time period. And if we head on over to our next slide, we'll see another stone that I really enjoy highlighting. This is from a different era. This is from the 19th century, and this is from the Richmond Terrace cemeteries that I showed you guys earlier. So this stone is one that we always talk about on the tours, and this was the stone of a woman named Catherine Wells. And Catherine Wells was a mom. And at this time in the 19th century, mourning was something that was done publicly. So if you were grieving your loss and you were deep in the depths of sorrow, you would make that known publicly and you would go into what was called formal mourning. At that point, you would wear only black. There were different rules of mourning depending on the closeness relationship to the deceased. Widows would go into mourning from anywhere between a year or even 2 years in some cases. It was a different story than today, where grief is more of a private thing. And the inscription on Catherine's tombstone is a very typically Victorian epitaph. It's over the top, it's heartbreaking, and it's dramatic. And it's one of the longest inscriptions in the Fassy cemeteries. It reads as follows: "Gone home, gone home. The door through which she vanished closed with a jar and left us here alone. We stand without in tears, forlorn and banished, longing to follow where one loved has gone." So this is definitely one of the most moving inscriptions in our cemeteries. And I figured what better way to highlight the poetry of the dead or the type of inscriptions that you find on historic gravestones. If we head on over to our next slide, we're going to hear about a tragic story from the 19th century. Now, Catherine Wells' gravestone is still there to see. It's available to anyone to look with their eyes and see the lengthy inscription on the stone, but sometimes a story is a little bit harder to find, and that is the case with this gravestone. So in a picture here, I'm dressed as a 19th century sailor, and I'm giving a tour of the cemetery, and I'm standing next to the grave of Daniel Webster Decker. And the tombstone is worn totally clear. There's really nothing visible that you can see through the inscription. But thanks to the efforts of historians who lived in the early 20th century here on Staten Island, there are records of what these gravestones say. And using those records, we were able to determine that the individual buried here was named Daniel Webster Decker, and a subsequent search of newspapers at the time revealed a really tragic obituary. And any way that I recap this story will just simply not be as impactful as the verbatim transcript of the newspapers at the time. So I'm just going to read to you what they said in their own language at that time. A sad event. A sad occurrence on Saturday morning last brought great grief with the family of Captain Daniel Decker at Mariners Harbor and cast a gloom over the entire community. This was the death by drowning of Daniel Webster Decker, son of Captain Decker. It seems that after taking a load of oysters at Prince's Bay upon the sloop Van Rensselaer, which was in charge of Captain Decker and his sons, Webster and David, they sailed for New York. The deck was covered with oysters, so that no passageway was left. And in order to pass from one part of the boat to the other, it was necessary to walk upon the rail. As the vessel was passing Bay Ridge, the sea being pretty rough, Webster attempted to pass from the front to the rear and slipped from the rail into the water. He was attired in a heavy oilcloth coat and wore heavy India rubber boots, the tops fastened about his waist, and India rubber mittens on his hands. As he went overboard and the sloop passed him, his father reached over the side and attempted to catch him, but only tore the buttons from his coat. His brother David then jumped into the small boat and tried, but ineffectually, once or twice to reach him. On the second or third effort, David was able to seize his hand, but the India rubber mitten came off and he was left some distance away at the mercy of the waves. Before another effort could be made to go towards him, he lifted his hands, bade his brother goodbye, and sank to rise no more. Search for the body on that and the succeeding days was made without success. Mr. Decker offered a reward of $50 to anyone who should find it. So this is a really tragic story. It's interesting in that the newspapers of the time list so many details about what happened. So not only do they describe what happened, the manner of his death, they also describe in vivid detail, as if you were there that day, the sequence of events. And it's really illustrative of the way that the press wrote about events at that time. The body was eventually found, the reward was claimed, and he was buried here in the Decker family plot in Staten Island Cemetery. Okay, so moving on, we're gonna go to our next slide and talk about a famous case. For those of you who are familiar with New York City true crime history, or even Staten Island history, you might recognize this story, the Christmas murders. So Emmeline and Annalisa Hausman were living in Graniteville. The year it's 1843. It's Christmas Day, and a fire breaks out at the family house. People rush over, they break down the door, and they attempt to rescue, and they find this young woman and her infant child dead in the house. But their cause of death was not fire, it was violence. Marks on the body indicate that they had been murdered. Suspicion immediately fell, of course, on Polly Bodine. And if you've ever heard of Polly Bodine, showmaster P.T. Barnum called her the Witch of Staten Island. Her case became famous around the country. She made headlines all around America as she went on trial for this double murder. If you go to the next slide, we'll see a picture of these events that was published in the press at the time. And this is a very over-the-top, dramatized rendering of events. Polly indeed does look like a witch in this description, but we actually know that she was a young woman around her 30s. And if we head on over to the next slide, we will see that a famous figure, who I'm sure all of you will know, opined about this case and wrote his thoughts about this case. So that is a photo of Edgar Allan Poe, and he was in New York City at this time. He was a crime reporter, and he commented on the Polly Bodine trial. And he said, quote, "The trial of Polly Bodine will take place at Richmond on Monday next and will no doubt excite much interest. This woman may possibly escape, for they manage these things wretchedly in New York." Sure enough, Poe was right. Polly Bodine ends up being acquitted of the murders, and she goes on to live her life in anonymity and shame on Staten Island. The community is very hostile towards her, and there's even an attempt to throw her body into the river after she passes away. So it's a very dramatic saga, and Emmeline and Annalisa rest in one of the Fassy cemeteries. If we head on over to our next slide, we'll see another individual from history. Military history fans might recognize this dapper gentleman. His name was Alfred Napoleon Alexander Natty Duffier. So he was born in Paris, France. He was the son of a French count, and he fell in love with a Staten Island heiress. So he ends up running away to Staten Island. He has a lengthy military career here in the US. He rose through the ranks. He was colonel of the 1st Rhode Island Volunteer Cavalry. He led a brigade cavalry in the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Brandy Station, Virginia. He was captured by the Confederates and was a war prisoner. He had a really interesting life, and he gets this name Natty, or so it's said, from his tendency to keep himself extremely well groomed. He would have been what was described at the time as a gentleman, a very handsome, well-dressed individual, a dandy in 19th century terms. So if we head on to our next slide, speaking of war, we will actually hear about a woman at war. So Emmeline Long Earl is resting at one of our Fassy cemeteries. She was born in 1835 and died in 1926. She was a mother and a wife, and she is also the only Staten Island woman documented to have gone into service during the Civil War. She served as a nurse and a cook. And she was buried in an unmarked grave until 2012. And that's when Fassy undertook fundraising efforts to finally get her a tombstone. So if you were ever on Staten Island and you want to go visit Staten Island's only female servicewoman, you can do so at Lake Cemetery in Graniteville. Our next slide is death in the line of duty. So this is the gravestone of Chief William Janes. And Janes was the only fire chief to die in the line of duty on Staten Island. And his death was a tragic story that captured headlines around New York. And if we head on to the next slide, we will see a photo of him and a little obituary from the newspapers at the time, which I will read to you guys. Ex-Chief William H. Janes of the North Shore Fire Department, Staten Island, and a member of the Wyandotte Hook and Ladder Company, died yesterday afternoon at the S.R. Smith Infirmary, New Brighton, from injuries received at a fire in Elm Park Monday afternoon. Janes was on top of the ladder of the burning building when the chimney suddenly collapsed. He was thrown to the ground and the bricks fell on him, crushing his head and body. Janes was 35 years old and was in the oil business on Broadway, West New Brighton. He was a daring firefighter and several times received severe injuries while displaying heroism. He leaves a wife and family behind. Ex-Chief Janes was a member of the Board of Fire Representatives of the North Shore. That body called a special meeting and will take charge of the funeral arrangements. All firehouses on the North Shore are being draped in black. So this last line is a reference to that 19th century tradition of mourning that I was discussing earlier. We know from this obituary that the firehouses on the North Shore of Staten Island were all decorated for mourning. So black swags and black bands were tied around the posts of the building or from the windows. And this was done when public figures passed away as a sign of respect. Jane's funeral, which happened at the Staten Island Cemetery, was said to have drawn a crowd of nearly 5,000 people. So the cemetery was jam-packed with those who wanted to pay their respects to the late chief. And actually, it turns out that in a shocking twist, somebody dies at Jane's funeral. There's a young boy from the neighborhood. He's with his friends. His name is James McAvoy. They are climbing around, getting up on trees, climbing on tall gravestones, wanting to get a good vantage point of the goings-ons at the funeral. And unfortunately, this young boy picks the wrong monument to climb up. He climbs up a large, tall monument at the cemetery. It suddenly destabilizes under his weight, and it falls and unfortunately crushes him on the scene. So his death occurs at this big funeral at Staten Island Cemetery, and he too ends up being buried in the same cemetery. So it's a very interesting turn of events. If we head on to our next slide, no cemetery tour would be complete without a few ghost stories, right? And these are always everyone's favorites, especially during this time of year as Halloween approaches. So this story, this is our best and most famous ghost story, is about a 19th century sea captain. His name was John Barker. He lived from 1799 to 1863. And John Barker grew up in a seaside town near Salem, Massachusetts. His ancestors were actually among those accused of witchcraft during the Salem hysteria. Barker goes to sea at a young age, and many boys of the time did this. He would have been about 12 or 13 years old, and he struck out alone and found a ship that would take him and began this life of adventure on the sea. He was actually captured in the War of 1812, and he currently rests at the Staten Island Cemetery. But there's debate about how peaceful that rest is, because John Barker's spirit has been seen many times at the cemetery. So on this slide, there is a photo of his house. The house is located about a block or two away from the cemetery. And about 20 years ago, his home was purchased by somebody in the neighborhood. They started doing renovations. They began to see a spirit in the house, and they contacted the executive director at the time of Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries. They explained the situation. They told her what address they were living at, and she recognized this as the old Barker house. And we actually have a painting of what John Barker looked like. It's also visible on this slide. It's at the center there. And when she showed this gentleman the painting, he immediately knew that that was the gentleman he was seeing in his house, the ghost that was appearing. So he didn't want to play any games. So he had faith leaders of several different denominations come to the house, perform blessings. There was a procession to the cemetery, and they planted 2 little flowers at John Barker's grave. And this, according to legend, is when the sightings of John Barker stop at the old Barker house and start in our cemetery. And time again over the years, individuals matching a very specific description have reported either seeing, feeling, or otherwise experiencing ghostly activity at John Barker's gravesite. And it's always the same type of person. It's always a woman, and she's usually in her mid-30s, very beautiful, but never made up. So never with a face of makeup. And time again, this same type of individual has come to the cemetery to either do family research or, curious about the site. And they'll be at that gravesite and have some type of experience. And when they talk to a staff member, they will find out that that indeed is Captain Barker's grave, and they are the type of person who he often appears to. And we at FASI actually had a really interesting event happen at one of our cemetery tours. So this was 2019. It was All Souls Day, and we were leading a large group of about 25 or 30 people through the cemetery. And when we got to Captain Barker's gravesite, I introduced the story. I stepped aside. Our executive director, Lynn Rogers, stepped up and began to explain the tale of John Barker. And as we're telling the story, I'm watching somebody in the crowd, and she's looking increasingly distressed. Her eyes are widening. She's whispering to the people next to her. I gesture over and I say, "Is everything all right?" And she goes on to tell me, "Look, I really didn't want to be here today. This was kind of my sister's idea to come on this tour. But as I was waiting for things to start, I was standing by this particular grave. I had my phone up to take a picture, so my arms were like this. And I felt what I could only describe as the feeling of ice cold hands wrap around my waist." And sure enough, she did match the description of the many women who've seen John Barker in the past. And we jokingly told her, "I guess you're his type." And we never saw her again. She never came to another one of my tours. So I think that that VIP experience, that personal ghost story, was more than enough for that tour. If we head on to our next slide, we have a picture of John Barker's gravesite. And appropriately, his epitaph reads, "His name shall endure forever." So that's a very fitting epitaph for the cemetery ghost, because even century plus after his death, we are still talking about him, and we are still using the name John Barker. So it seems that that was an apt prediction for a tombstone inscription. If we head on over to our next slide, we have a really amusing ghost story from history. So the title of this newspaper article is "Richmond's Ghost Dodges Policemen." So the subtitle reads, watching in vain for specter carrying a tombstone near Old Cemetery. So the story here is that during the 1920s, the early 1920s, there is a really old cemetery in the Emerson Hill neighborhood of Staten Island. That cemetery was the Old Clove Baptist Cemetery. And that cemetery was in a state of neglect for a very long time, even before the 1920s. There are records from Staten Island historians noting from the mid 1800s saying, who's going to take care of this spot? Should not the Baptist honor their long sleeping dead? So even in the 19th century, the cemetery was in a decline. It was not being maintained, and it got this reputation of being a lonely and haunted place. And the culmination of all of these neighborhood ghost stories happens in the 1920s when this newspaper article is published. And I'll read it to you verbatim. One sergeant and 4 patrolmen, somewhat nervous but resolved to do their duty, mounted guard at the Old Baptist Cemetery at Concord, Staten Island, last night in the hope that they might catch the ghost that frightened a motorman on one of Mayor Hyland's one-man trolley cars nearly out of his wits early yesterday and led to the breaking of windows in Mayor Hyland's municipal car barn and in the rectory of St. Simon's Episcopal Church next door. At least the people of Concord had the hope that the policeman would catch the ghost. Whether the policeman had the same hope was a question. According to stories told by persons well known for their veracity and backed up by sworn testimony in police court, a ghost carrying a tombstone on his back wandered out of the cemetery at 3 o'clock in the morning, boarded Mayor Hyland's car without paying the fare, and walked out a rear window without breaking the glass. So the ghost simply faded out of the back window. Then he pulled off the trolley pole and left the hysterical motorman in darkness. Loud moans from the motorman attracted 19 men from the top of Emerson Hill, where they had been watching for the ghost. When they heard his story, they armed with bricks and stones and went back to watch some more. So this sighting of the ghost by the trolleyman, he's driving his trolley, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden he looks at the cemetery and sees this specter wandering out, carrying its own tombstone on its back. And the ghost comes into the trolley car and frightens the man out of his wits. And he swears to this to the police. The whole neighborhood is riled up. People, teenagers, young men go to see what's the case with the ghost. This becomes such a phenom and such a, big occurrence here on Staten Island that people from Brooklyn, New Jersey, all make pilgrimages to the Old Clove Baptist Cemetery to get a peek at the ghost. And there are so many people coming nightly by the carload to see if the ghost will appear again that local vendors actually start taking advantage of the situation. So they make little talismans and amulets, souvenirs to sell to the curious who are coming there. And they set up shop by the Old Clove Baptist Cemetery. So this is a ghost story that really rocked people's worlds in the early 1920s. It was a big phenomenon here on Staten Island, and it's said that hundreds of people came to get a glimpse at the specter. So with that being said, we head on to our last slide of the tour. And I just want to thank you for joining us tonight. FASI really appreciates all of your interest and support, and we would love it if you connected with us digitally. So we have a Facebook link. It's facebook.com/Staten Island Cemetery. And this is where you can connect with us on Facebook. We'll post upcoming tours that we have. We'll post volunteer opportunities to come clean up some of the cemeteries. And we'll share some interesting tales, whether they're ghost stories or epitaphs on moving tombstones or any of the things that we love so much about these cemeteries. But I want to thank you all. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them.
It looks like we have some things in the chat if you want to check that.
Okay, sure. So Joseph Smith wrote, "We can thank William T. Davis and Royden Vosberg for transcribing the inscriptions of gravestones in the early 1900s." Yes, they were the Staten Island historians that I was alluding to. They did amazing work here on Staten Island. They went to many of our local cemeteries and wrote word for word the things that they saw on the tombstones. And this was really important because in the years since this project, a lot of the stones that they transcribed are no longer legible. So if they hadn't done this work, we would have lost a lot of information about our Staten Island cemeteries. So yes, they are indeed deserving of all of those thanks. Someone else wrote in the chat, this was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Thank you, Barbara, for your compliment as well. Caroline wrote, "Where are the oldest Dutch graves?" So those would not be in the Fassy cemeteries. There's actually a cemetery on Staten Island in the Port Richmond neighborhood, and it's the Cemetery of the Reformed Dutch Church. And if you go to that churchyard, you will see these old brownstone gravestones, and some of them will have the winged spirit head, some of them will have winged skulls, and some of them are actually in Dutch. So if you go to this little graveyard, you will see some really old tombstones with Dutch inscriptions. Ruth wrote in the chat, "Where can we access the funeral books?" So if you look up Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries online, you will find our website. It's GenWeb. That's the name of the hosting facility. And this is where all of the transcribed records are. So if you take a look through that website, you'll be able to see not only those like the information from the books, but also information about the cemeteries themselves, and not only Fassy cemeteries, but indeed other Staten Island cemeteries as well. So Joseph Smith wrote, "I wonder if the woman resembled Ann Barker." I wonder that myself. It is interesting, though, that Anne did not pass away as a very young woman. I believe she died in middle age, but I'd have to double check that. So I really am wondering, who is this young woman that Captain Barker's spirit seems so attached to? It's definitely interesting to wonder about, right? Thank you, Pat, for your compliment. We appreciate it very much. Thank you, Diane. That's very nice of you to say as well. Jessica asked, "How did you get involved in this work?" So I always like to tell this story. I'm from an old Staten Island family, I guess you could say. My family has been on Staten Island since the 1850s, although I didn't know that until a year or two ago. But I've always been interested in ghost stories, and I've always been interested in, what they say about us as, people. What do they say about culture? What do they say about people's interests? What do they say about our fascination with life after death? And so I got involved in Staten Island history, and I was really impressed with the number of interesting stories that I was finding, ghost stories, legends about, spirits and witches and things. I was really impressed. I didn't associate those type of stories with Staten Island. I always assumed that, that was something that Salem could take credit for, or other New England states. So I was really excited to hear that. And I met Lynn Rogers, and we arranged a tour, and the rest was history. I have been really hooked on this type of research ever since then. So that's a great question, Jessica. Pat asked, "The bones found at the Thompsonville quarantine, were they determined to be all Irish by DNA? I thought some were German." So Pat, I believe the majority were determined to be Irish. If there were some German among them, I'm not 100% sure about that. If Lynn's still in the chat, she might be able to write an answer, because Lynn was, instrumental in getting that project done. Those who don't know, there's a quarantine cemetery on the North Shore of Staten Island. This was filled with the bodies of those who perished with the Irish hunger. They came over to the United States. They were sick. They were starving. And the cemetery was eventually forgotten, and it was going to be obliterated. And Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries stepped in and saved the site. So if you go today, there's actually a little grass patch with a sign on it and some flowers. And this is where the cemetery would have been located at that time. Jessica wrote that she's also related to many hanged in the Salem witch trials. It truly was an unfortunate period in American history. And it's really interesting that so many people can, trace their ancestry back to that sad moment in our history. Ruth wrote, you mentioned brownstones. Is that the same as sandstone? Yeah, these red stones, there were a couple of different materials, and most of them were quarried in New Jersey. And if you're familiar with these old stones or interested in these old stones, you can do some Google homework on the Jersey Carvers. And the Jersey Carvers were a group of stonemasons from New Jersey, and they carved these particular gravestones with the winged faces, the skulls, the hourglasses. There's some really interesting info about them out there. Some of them took, for example, like a side of beef as payment for a gravestone. Really interesting stories about the Jersey Carvers. So if that's of interest to you, I definitely recommend checking that out. And Lynn wrote, about 30,000 transcriptions from Dempsey Funeral Home books are online. Sylvie and Steers books are held at the FASI office. If you have a specific lookup, email sicemetery@gmail.com. Lynn also wrote that all of the remains at the quarantine cemetery were tested and they were found to be Celtic. Carol wrote Native American, African American burial grounds. Yes, so there are two really, Sylvan Cemetery in Travis is one of our oldest FASI properties. It is believed that that site was originally a Native American burial ground. Staten Island Cemetery, we know for a fact, has many African American burials, and it's believed that the site right next to Staten Island Cemetery, which was once the Church of the Ascension, was a Native American burial ground. There were excavations done there in, I believe, the 1920s that skeletons were found and arrowheads and things of that nature. There was a Native American fishing village in the neighborhood. So that site does have a very long connection with the Native American community, the Lenape. Good question, Carol. All right, so I think that's it, unless anyone had anything else. But feel free to connect with us. As I said, we're always in need of volunteers or interested parties and people who want to come and experience the cemeteries. So I linked our Facebook page. It was a pleasure having you guys. If there's anything else we can do for you, send us an email at sicemetery@gmail.com or connect with us on Facebook at Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely, very informative, very fun. We also, for anyone who is unaware, Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries was one of our Six to Celebrate groups back in 2014. So we do have a self-guided walking tour brochure. You can go to the website 62celebrate.org and you can download the PDF for free, or you can buy a physical copy. So I highly encourage anyone to do that. You can read up on it. If you have a chance to actually get out to the cemeteries, they are beautiful. It's a lovely little day trip. Or I guess if you live in Staten Island, just pop on over. But yeah, so again, 6tocelebrate.org. And yes, if you have any other questions, feel free to email us. Check out our website, htc.org. And with that, I will say good night and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.